first, a new face for the Supreme Court, if only the president's pick of Elena Kagan was, in fact, really that. She's a woman. Her confirmation would bring the court a little further out of the gender dark ages. But politically, Democrats acting cautiously where Republicans push ideologically, there's not much new in that. For all the questions about where Kagan stands on key issues, there should be no question of where she'll take the court after Justice Stevens. Where he was outspoken, she so far has been the opposite of that. Chief Justice Earl Warren once wrote that the job of the court was to correct inequality. Quote, "Where there is injustice, we should correct it. Where there is poverty, we should eliminate it. Where there is corruption, we should stamp it out." Courage on the court. Do we even remember what it looks like anymore? We'll talk about that and more with Cathy Albisa of Nesri coming up.
During her time in this office, she's repeatedly defended the rights of shareholders and ordinary citizens against unscrupulous corporations. Last year, in the Citizens United case, she defended bipartisan campaign finance reform against special interests seeking to spend unlimited money to influence our elections. Despite long odds of success, with most legal analysts believing the government was unlikely to prevail in this case, Elena still chose it as her very first case to argue before the court. I think that says a great deal, not just about Elena's tenacity, but about her commitment to serving the American people.
Tenacity and service. We're going to talk about women in the law next up with our very special guest, Cathy Albisa. She's the executive director of Nesri, which is the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. Cathy, welcome to the program. Welcome back to GRITtv.
Thank you, Laura.
We're going to be talking in a minute about somebody that you worked very closely with, Rhonda Copelon, former vice president of the Center for Constitutional Rights, and so much more, who passed away at the end of last week. As we think about courage and the word that the president used, tenacity, what's your take on Kagan to begin?
Well, I mean, as you read all the buzz and the articles, what really struck me was that the fact that nobody knew exactly what she thought at this stage in her career was actually perceived as a strange sort of strength. And that I found that so profoundly troubling, that we've entered an era where not standing for something is actually considered a positive.
At least if it comes from Democrats.
Right.
What are the issues that you would look for her record, to her record, for some kind of position on? What is the key stuff that you expect somebody who will be perhaps getting a life appointment to the court would have made herself clear on?
Well, I mean, the entire purpose of our tripartite structure and the purpose of the court is to have this body that's insulated from these political pressures and that will correct course when politics are taking such a nasty turn that our more vulnerable members of the population are at risk, where our dearest principles are not being upheld.
So like what?
Well, it's everything from the war on terror issues, where that's where some very dear principles are at risk, to the rights of the poor, the rights of women, the rights, rights around race, rights around sexual orientation. These are always the contentious issues for the courts, and there's a very disappointing history in the last several decades of the court, where rather than evolve towards a more vigorous rights jurisprudence, we've actually gotten behind the rest of the world. We're one of the only courts that has no positive rights at all, that doesn't recognize economic and social rights, that really is stuck in an 18th century jurisprudence in very many ways.
Well, what do you mean by positive and negative rights, particularly positive rights? As you say, we don't really have them in our constitutional per se. We can get into that. So what do you mean, and how do they exist elsewhere?
Well, the conversation about positive rights in the United States was actually quite alive around the 1930s. And there's this terrific book by Cass Sunstein called The Second Bill of Rights that discusses that. The entire world, in fact, was sort of moving towards this discussion of it's not just what the government can't do, but it's also what it must do. And the discussion and the debate at that time recognized that we had become such a complex society, such an interdependent society, that in fact, by not doing something, you are doing something. By not regulating the banks, you are hurting people. That's a perfect example. The court, throughout the 60s and 70s, was actually slowly moving in a direction recognizing this new reality But then when it sort of got stacked with very reactionary justices, it pulled back. And it stopped playing the vital role that a judicial entity of that kind needs to play in society.
Now, one of the great crusaders and articulators of positive rights in this country was Rhonda Copelon, your former colleague, former vice president of the Center for Constitutional Rights, a professor at CUNY, City University of New York Law School, a founder of the International Law Clinic, a women's law clinic, and the Women's Center for Gender Justice. We found a piece of tape of her talking actually to you on CUNY TV about this very question. Here's Rhonda.
If you read the international human rights documents, you see that states have both a negative responsibility to respect and not to do harm, and a positive responsibility to protect. The failure to address domestic violence was a human rights problem because the state failed in its obligation to protect people against that violence. You don't see that in the U.S. Constitution, for example. We don't have any positive obligations.
That's a relatively recent clip from 2009. Rhonda passed away last week, age of 65, after a nasty fight with cancer. She'd been working on this issue, though, for decades.
Yes.
Talk about some of her key cases.
Well, Rhonda, everyone talks about how McCrae v. Harris and Filartica v. Pena came down on the same day, I believe. And that represents a lot about Rhonda's life and Rhonda's work. So she had argued Harris v. McCrae in the Supreme Court.
Remind people what that was about.
That was the case that basically banned funding in Medicaid for poor women's abortions, which in essence banned abortions for many, many poor women. And Rhonda was outraged at this. It was outraged at poor women being treated differently than other women, outraged that, in a society that claimed to have such a respect for individual rights, the government would meddle with that and not respect the autonomy of women simply because they were poor. And she really thought it was because of their poverty. And she was devastated when she lost that case, absolutely devastated.
But the very same day, the decision in Filartica came down.
The very same day, she had, with Peter Weiss, litigated Filartica v. Pena, which was a case that claimed that the Alien Torts Claim Act, a very old law, actually held human rights violators accountable in the United States for torts committed against non-citizens. And they had sued a Paraguayan torturer. And she had worked with the family to sort of gain justice for them. And that opened up a new world for her. And she really became committed to international law as a general matter and bringing it back to the United States.
She worked on issues of rape in wartime as a war crime. She worked on domestic violence, as you've heard. A very different kind of person, clearly, from Elena Kagan. As we close, and we probably just have about 30 seconds, do you think it's too much for us to imagine that a Rhonda Copelon of tomorrow could one day be on the Supreme Court? Are we always going to be seeing picks like this henceforth?
If we don't start imagining it, we won't be able to make it happen.
Cathy Albisa is with Nesri. We'll put a link to Nesri at our website and also more information about the fund that's been started in Rhonda Copelon's name. You're watching GRITtv.